So let's do the drinking game favourites. Okay, so having analysed all 50 episodes, which artists do you think we mention most of all on the podcast? Okay, now I'll give you a few bubbling under first. Bubbling under, these didn't make the top 10.
Mm-hmm.
David Sylvian.
Yeah.
Kate Bush.
I'm surprised.
Rupert Hine.
Again, surprised.
Kevin Coyne. Neil Young. Todd Rundgren. Swans, not the Swans, as you keep incorrectly pronouncing it on the podcast. There's no definite article. Swans.
Yeah, but you actually said Cupid and Psyche.
Don't start that.
And I was going to correct you saying, well, it's actually Psyche, but I was too
Don't
polite.
say that. Okay, right. Dead Can Dance. These are still bubbling under. Okay, Dead Can Dance. Tom Waits. XTC. Bill Nelson. Miles Davis. Prefab Sprout / Paddy McAloon and 10cc Godley and Cream. Okay. More of them later when we get
bubbling
to the
under,
album.
yeah.
Well, no, when we get to the quintessential album years albums. Okay, right. Here is the top 10 of the most ubiquitous. There's a word I've probably used a lot. Yeah, ubiquitous artists on the Album Years podcast. Coming in at number 10. Sneaking in under the wire, and probably the most obscure of all these, but we mention him a lot.
Yeah.
Momus. Now, has anyone here investigated Momus as a result of us mentioning him too much on the podcast?
One person.
And you're now a massive fan, right?
Yeah.
So I loved the enthusiasm there.
Yeah. Number 9, I've actually put these two together because they, in some ways, they are synonymous. John Martyn and Nick Drake, two of the greatest British singer-songwriters ever. Again, neither of them were what you would call ever artists that crossed over to the mainstream, but their albums have become beloved because they are so spiritual, so beautiful, so pure, and I think they continue to be rediscovered generation after generation, don't they? Nick Drake, I mean, arguably more famous now than he's ever been.
Yeah, well, certainly during his lifetime.
Sold 5,000 records.
Yeah.
But John Martyn's an interesting one, isn't it? Because this is a great example, and we'll come on to another example in this in a minute, where the music almost belies the unpleasantness of the person that makes it.
Yeah.
You and I have both read books about John Martyn. He wasn't a very nice man, was he?
That's putting it mildly, isn't it?
Number 8, another perhaps person that is not known for their affability, Van Morrison. We talk about Van a lot on the show, don't we? He's kind of a real outlier, isn't he? I mean, he's still out there. He's still doing it. He's more prolific than ever. He just kind of has carved out this incredibly unique position for himself in the music industry.
He still has an amazing voice as well. I mean, the thing is, he's late 70s and he's still
raging against the world as well.
And it's still raging against the world, yes, in controversial fashion, as always.
So I think on the very first episode that we ever did, we deliberately picked it so that we could talk about Van Morrison's Common One.
Well, this, I think, was kind of picking an album that we both adored, that was ignored by even Van Morrison fans. I think I said that every book I'd ever read on him detested this album. You know, this album was pretentious, meandering, an insult to the references he used, whereas for us it was mystical, spiritual, ambitious, and a kind of prelude to Talk Talk's Spirit of Eden and Laughing Stock, and coming out of something like Miles Davis in a silent way. This was purely spiritually motivated music. And it's interesting that I had a conversation with somebody who worked with Van Morrison, and she managed a studio that he owned in Beckington in Somerset, and said that the best of him came out through his music, that he realized how difficult he was, but if you wanted to hear the soul of him, just listen to the music, and that was where he was more articulate. And I'm sure that for some people, you know, music is this escape, that life is difficult, but the music is a cure. One gig I did recently, somebody came up to me with a copy of Common One and made me sign it. Because they'd heard it mentioned on the album Years and had liked Van Morrison but never bought the album and absolutely fell in love with it. And they got that it was this kind of missing link between In a Silent Way and Spirit of Eden, that it was one of those albums It was a complete outlier. You know, this was 1980 at a time when a lot of music had become a lot more urban, a lot more political, a lot more produced.
But it's funny, isn't it? Because
And this was the antithesis.
he kind of, I mean, he is obviously a big name. Everyone kind of knows Van Morrison. Everyone's heard of Van Morrison, but he kind of exists in this little bubble in the mainstream, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Where he's just out on his own, and he's never really made a bad record. You know, he just keeps making these records that sound like Van. And obviously we have our favourites. This gentleman here mentioned Veed and Fleece, you know, obviously, which is another. For a lot of people, they wouldn't. I think similarly, they wouldn't know that record either. We could have easily picked that one too, couldn't we?
Yeah,
As kind of-
fantastic record.
yeah, and a relatively underrated, unknown record, certainly in terms of his catalogue. Number 7, my favourite band, the greatest band of all time, Pink Floyd. Yes, thank you. The greatest band of all time. I have said many times, for me, Pink Floyd was my Beatles. I never really understood. Well, that's not fair to say I didn't understand the Beatles. I understand what's great about them. I was never that much obsessive about the Beatles. Pink Floyd were my Beatles. They still are my favourite band. I have so much of them in my DNA, whether I want it or not. They come out. I mean, I can't tell you the amount of times I've written or made a new piece of music, and I've played it to my wife or to my friend. And I said, "Listen to this. You've never heard me do anything like this before." And they'll say, "Yeah, very Floydy." No, no, because it's just. I guess it's in my DNA. I can't help it. You know, in much the same way that all your music ends up sounding like Chicory Tip, Tim. It just comes out whether you want it or not.
Well, it was, you know, sing Chicory Tip on Top of the Pops. It was.
I know. It was an
pivotal
epiphany for
moment,
you,
know?
yeah. So Pink Floyd.
Well, Pink Floyd were one of mine. I mean, one of the interesting things that they say, when we first knew each other, we'd send each other very eclectic tapes with the Swans, amongst other things. But, you know, Pink Floyd and Donna Summer were two influences that we both had when we were very, very young. And for me, it was because I heard it. I think a friend's dad had a cassette collection of Tangerine Dream, Mike Oldfield, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin. And we used to listen to this as we were playing Sabutio games. And it just seeped in. And certainly for me, I think it was Wish You Were Here was the first album I heard, that and Atom Heart Mother in the same session. And they were beguiling. And it was a combination of the atmosphere of the music, the intensity, the emotions, but also the cover artwork that kind of gave it a dimension of otherness.
To me, there's another aspect to it also, which is that Pink Floyd were my gateway to experimental avant-garde music.
Mhm.
I heard Ummagumma when I was like 13 years old, and the second record of that particularly. I mean, much like Revolution 9 would have maybe
Yeah.
been, you know, a lot of people's introduction to, you know, experimental music in the context of that record. Ummagumma was that for me. That was where I first heard experimental techniques and led me to this whole, you know, rabbit hole of Karlheinz Stockhausen and, you know, noise music. So Pink Floyd for me have been, you know, important in that respect too. Right, number 6, Tim. And I think this, I might be going out on a limb here, but I'm going to say this is probably your number 1 artist of all time, all things told, which is David Bowie. Would I be
Okay.
right? Would I say on balance?
It may well be, yeah.
So we talk about Bowie a lot, and I think the important thing about Bowie is that what we love about him is this sense of constantly confronting expectations of his audience.
Yeah.
And that's why, for us, he's such a touchstone for the album, is this idea that you don't simply give your audience more of the same. You reinvent yourself, you change the people you work with, you change the goalposts, you move the goalposts all the time. And yet he pulled it off almost every time. At least for a long time, he was pulling it off every time.
Yeah, and I think also there is a, you know, one of the things he was often dismissed as being is a kind of a fabrication, which of course he himself refers to this.
Yeah,
But I think
nothing wrong with
through
that.
these fabrications and through these masks, there was a tremendous passion and intensity. You know, I think this was quite an emotional, insecure, intense person. And however much he disguised that, it came through the music, and that communicated to an audience on a level. I think this is the thing, that the music communicated on several levels, both often as excellent commercial music or excellent music that had shifted in terms of its genre, but equally I think there was a kind of a solid emotional core. I mean, my introduction was, I think at school, somebody was selling tapes they got from Saudi Arabia for about 12.5 pence. And the half pence was important. And Low I got from this because I thought the cover was intriguing. And
but that's interesting. Something else you touched on there. Another thing about Bowie is that he was somebody that managed to pull off all the time this magic trick, which very few artists in history really have ever pulled it off. I'll tell you who does do it now is Radiohead, is in maintaining a massive global success, commercial level of success, and yet making quite strange experimental music. And I think that's something that he pulled off for almost the entirety of the 70s. That you get these albums, which are I mean, Ashes to Ashes is a very strange fashion, very strange pop single. So he's kind of Sound and Vision, he's kind of walking that tightrope between being an experimental artist, but still being able to maintain the popular sort of vote, if you like. And I can count on one hand, artists that have done that over the years, really. Prince probably did it in the 80s. Taylor Swift again. I mean, albums like Folk. I know you're not a big fan, Tim, but Folklore, the albums that she put out during COVID, they endeared her to the sort of hipster alternative crowd. And that is something that very few artists have ever managed to pull off and still maintain their status as the biggest pop star in the world. I am a Taylor fan, guys. You can probably tell. I really got a lot of time for her. Number 5, the Bowser's old buddy, Mr. Eno. He's got his finger in a lot of pies, Mr. Eno, to be fair, so it's hard not to reference Eno. He's produced everything. He's worked with everyone, including David Bowie, of course. So we do mention the Eno a fair bit on the show.
Well, I think one of the things that links a lot of the artists that we're drawn to, people like Eno, Bowie, Fripp, the Ham, and so on. These are people that were at home in the 1960s, the early 1970s, and managed to very naturally transfer into the era of punk, new wave, without compromise. And I think it's partly because there's something in their character that was there even in the 60s.
Well, I'll tell you what I think it is. It's because he's not a musician. He's an ideas, he's a conceptualist.
Fripp's a musician, and I think he managed to also navigate that,
But also the thing about Eno was he was very quick to align himself with the punk movement, the new wave movement. So he kind of rode that whole thing.
But during the time of punk, of course, one of his most important albums, it became more important afterwards, is Ambient One.
Yeah.
Music for Airports. Yeah. So, in some ways, during the time of punk, he'd already gone beyond that. And the same with Bowie, I think, that he'd anticipated it and was actually slightly bored by what that music was.
At number 4, In With a Bullet. Talk. We do talk about talk. We talk about talk.
We do.
Quite a lot on the show, don't we? Why do we talk about talk a lot? What is it about? Why do we talk about that?
Well, we were actually managed by Talk's
We don't need to go into that. Why do we talk about...
Look, people like a story, an anecdote.
Yeah, a showbiz anecdote.
A showbiz anecdote.
No, but it's a kind of rhetorical, because I know why we talk about Talk. Again, they're another band. They made 5 albums, and every one of them is different, isn't it? It's like a reinvention. Maybe arguably the last 2, sort of 2 sides of the same coin, isn't it?
Well, I think like the Blue Nile, Talk are impressive in the sense that they seem to be aiming towards one particular sound, one particular emotion, almost silence as well. They always talk of Hollis moving towards silence. And I think what I find particularly fascinating is beyond the music, that there's very little there, and it is almost reaching a logical conclusion. You can hear this also with Paul Buchanan's solo work, which takes the Blue Nile's blueprint that little bit further. They're always going towards this one perfect sound that seems very unaffected, but also that they've done very little. 4 albums in the Blue Nile's case, plus the Paul Buchanan solo album, 5 albums in Talks, and actually the first 2 albums which were reflective of the times around them. And yet the influence is massive. It's such a small body of work that's had an enormous impression.
I think the Blue Nile is another one we should probably put in Bubbling Under, because we do mention them quite a lot on the show. What's different between the Blue Nile and Talk to Me is that Talk's music is willfully quite ugly and experimental sometimes. It's not slick and beautiful the whole time. And I think that's what you're kind of referring to when you say they've been quite influential. Things like the whole post-rock scene, for me, starts with, if you listen to an album like Spirit of Eden, you can see how all of those bands that came out that called themselves post-rock bands, that's kind of like their year zero, isn't it? Mm-hmm. There's a kind of angular aspect to it too. Number 3, Scott Walker. So 95% of the mentions of Scott Walker came from him. But I love Scott. We love Scott, don't we?
We do.
And, much like Mark Hollis, I suppose he's kind of very released music very sporadically, at least in the last 30 years. He made one album a decade or something.
I mean, he kind of upped it a little bit towards the end.
Towards the end, what, 2 albums in a decade?
Yeah.
Woohoo. So but he's almost like, it's almost like he's making music. There's something about some of these artists that you feel when you listen to them, they are making music only for themselves. Only for themselves. They almost don't care if anyone else likes it. And sometimes that's a very appealing quality, isn't it? Do you know what I mean by that?
When it communicates, yeah. I mean, Scott Walker's later albums were almost a music as art project. And that can work, and it can be. I think in the case of Walker, he was so obsessive, so willful, and had these sounds in his head that he had to realize. Like, I think it's the famous story in one of the albums where there's a piece that is about, I think it's Mussolini and his wife or girlfriend being hung and beaten. Clara, yeah, being beaten.
Is that the one where he's
And so he
punching the
had
meat?
to bring in
Oh, yeah.
slabs of beef for the percussionist to hit. And I kind of love that madness, that sense of abandon to sort of fulfill your dream. I always like the story with Yes and Topographic Oceans, that they wanted to record in the country, but they couldn't go to the country. So they decided to bring bales of hay and plastic cows into the studio. And I kind of love the idea of that. And John Anderson wanted a particular sound with dripping water, so recorded something in the toilets. And it's that attention to detail and that willful following of your dream. And I think it's one of the reasons why Topographic is one of our favourite Yes albums, because,
we'll
this
talk
is a
about that
band
later,
at the peak of their popularity. And what do you do at the peak of popularity? Do you produce that Chicory Tip single that I'd try and make? No. You produce a double album with one track per side about various Eastern scriptures. That'll get you talked about. But it's still got to But what is fascinating is it got to #1 in America and Britain and probably other countries as well.
Number 2, Mr. Fripp, our bud,
Yeah,
our buddy Robert. We love Robert, don't we?
we do love him.
We love him. He's a sweetie. He's mad, but he's like a classic English eccentric. He's very eccentric. I really like Robert. He's great fun. But what an extraordinary career. What an extraordinary... I was just listening the other day to the first Eno album, Here Come the Warm Jets. That solo he plays on Babies on Fire.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's insane. It's insane. It's one of my favourite guitar solos of all time. It's just him turning up to do a guest spot on someone else's record.
Well, I think he's kind of a thoroughly original guitarist in terms of his tone and in terms of his harmony. And I think what's interesting is when he works with the likes of Eno, Bowie, or even on, No Man's Flowermouth, there's a sense of abandon that I don't think he necessarily... Well, he felt that he didn't necessarily bring as much to In King Crimson, which was a much more orchestrated, composed... I mean, we both know there's chaos and abandon in Crimson, but I remember him saying that, when he's doing the sessions, he has no preconception. If you're thinking of the Crimson pieces, they are so complex, so organised, so difficult to play, but he kind of relished this opportunity. And when he worked with us, it was how he worked with a lot of other people, that he didn't want to listen to the track beforehand. He wanted to respond to it. And it was phenomenal being in the room with him because music poured out of him. And, we did a couple of things. We did a thing where we'd created this obvious strategies and we showed him ridiculous photographs of what we wanted. So, we might show him Norman Collier. We said, we want a bit of this. And then we'd show him a photograph of Robert Fripp from 1974, but we also want some of this. And he took these cues. Usually he would actually go off into anecdotes about the people, the photographs that we'd shown him. But it was such an instinctive performance.
But the funny thing about Robert is, and he'll admit this, he's not a natural guitar player. So his style has all come from application and discipline. So he's kind of taught himself to play, and he has this very unique vocabulary when he plays the guitar because he's not a natural guitar player. He couldn't have sounded like Jimi Hendrix or Jimmy Page or Robin Trower, even if he'd wanted to. So he kind of developed this which the style he plays in is much like his personality. So it's fascinating from that point of view. But you're right, he's able to also respond in a very emotional way to music, which kind of belies his personality in a way. Number 1. Who's number 1? Peter Hammill, the Ham. Yes, we mentioned the Ham at least 5. Prince should have been in the Bubbling Under. Should have been Bubbling Under. I beg your pardon. But we're going to talk about Prince in the albums later on. The Ham. We try to mention the Ham at least 4 times in every 60 seconds of the podcast.
We
don't
do.
But part of the reason he's in the podcast so much is because he was very prolific over the years, and he did so
Are
many
you sure that isn't the word you've used the most?
prolific. No,
Yeah.
it's not. It's not. So many quintessential. Sorry, into syllable count definitely. In terms of artists we've probably talked about on the show, we've probably covered more of his albums than any others because every album is worth discussing in itself, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
almost like every album has its own little unique kind of world and approach and aesthetic.
And again, as I say, without compromise, this is somebody who responds to the psychedelic revolution of the late 60s,
Punk,
the underground
New
revolution of the
wave,
early 70s, then punk, new
singer-songwriter,
wave,
yeah.
and does it in such an idiosyncratic way that shows no compromise. And again, I think it's why we're drawn to it, that this personality, again, weaves his way even into the electro-pop world without losing an iota
The hamminess
that
of the
voice.
ham.
The hamminess of
The
the
hamminess of the ham.
Yeah.
But is it also, in a way, isn't he, the quintessential album as artist? Because most people don't know his work.
It does
Even
bubble
even
under the
people that
radar.
know his band, a lot of them don't know the solo work, which for me is superior. I mean, I love the solo work, but I love his band's albums too. But that's part of the reason why he's such a kind of an artist that you want to evangelize about. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Because the work is so extraordinary, so unique, so distinctive, and yet most people have never investigated it. I don't know what his record sales have been like over the years, but cult artist, I think, is.
I think Van der Graaf have always done better.
I'm not talking about Van der Graaf. That's what I'm saying. People know Van der Graaf, but the solo work, even people that like Van der Graaf don't
But Van der
know it.
Graaf, that's, think of Porn Hearts, which is one of the most extraordinary albums ever released. And if stories are to be believed, it was #1 in Italy for about a year.
Yeah,
and
I think
actually,
that's.
you can hear the influence on various Italian
That's what I
underground
mean.
bands. of
And I think that
period
album
as well.
probably has sold very well.
Yeah,
over the years.
Franco Battiato, this Is as well. Do you know the album Is? Was it?
Stephen, where should we start with Peter Hammill?
It depends. You see, that's a very good question, and I would need to know a little bit more about you before I could recommend. Because that's the point with Peter Hammill, is that there are different doorways that you would walk into his world. He made a punk rock album in 1975. He's done singer-songwriter, a confessional
then
singer-songwriter. He's done electro-pop albums, new wave albums, progressive rock albums. So I would need to know more about what you... It's the same when people ask me, what album should they check out of mine first? I say, well, what kind of music do you like? Because I've done all these different kinds of music, and I can recommend you one of my albums based on what I think you might like the best. So I can't answer your question, sir, except they're all great.
But also as well, it depends because some of his music is really quite scary to listen to. It's dissonant, it's extreme, it's passionate. Some of it is glacially beautiful. So it does, cover quite a number of extremes in terms of genre, but also mood and style. So, when I tend to do the joking, violent ham impression, on the episodes, which I did in front of Fish, bizarrely, in December when I met him. He went, very good. He liked it.
You do a good Peter Hammill impression, I must say, yeah.